Welcome to our webinar today. Our webinar is Co-Located School Safety with Jaffe Emergency Services. Today's presenter is Kat Searcy, Managing Director of Learning and Management Practice and a member of Jaffe's senior leadership team. And before Kat gets started, I just want to say that I was introduced to Jaffe about a year ago, I believe, when Chris Jaffe presented at a Council for American Private Education board meeting in Washington, D.C. And at that time, Chris had a presentation and took the audience on a quick reflection of the Uvalde school shooting. And it was incredibly impactful. And I think for a lot of the private school association leaders in that room, it really brought home how important school safety is and how there are specific practices that we really need to consider when looking at schools and early learning centers that are co-located with our places of worship. So I've been in contact with Kat and her team quite a bit, trying to bring best practice and resources to our membership. And today Kat's here to present best practices from Jaffe Emergency Services, and we are very honored to have her here. And so, Kat, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me into this virtual space with you today. And as named, our Jaffe team is focused on safety and equity and excellence and joyful kids learning across the country, right? That's all of our goals. And so we do that by making our schools, whatever shapes and size schools, looks like across the country's healthier and safer. So Corey named that she had heard Chris Jaffe, our CEO and founder, speak. He's on a lot of these slides, kind of bottom left of this middle picture right here. And so Chris has been working with schools since 2007. We started as a CPR first aid training business and expanded into supporting schools with assessments, with professional development. We staff security and EMTs at schools all across the country. We also do security and events for events and venues all across the country. Angel Stadium in LA to Cirque du Soleil across the country. And so we think even broader than just school safety, although the safety consultants I support mostly focus on schools. It's really communities. It's a community at a church. It's a community at a baseball game. Whatever that community looks like, we want to be a happy, healthy, and safe space. I'm originally from New York. I now live in Jacksonville, Florida with my husband and couple kiddos. I started as a classroom teacher, 6th grade math. I then ran school operations for a couple charter networks here in Jacksonville. And like Corey, I saw Chris present professional development, which made me that much more interested in and passionate about school safety. And so I've worked with the Jaffe team since 2018 with COVID support. We had a lot of schools tuning into our webinars about how to safely reopen during COVID, and then joined the team full-time in December 2021. So what I want to talk about today with this group is thinking through different buckets of concerns that can come up specifically in co-located school spaces where a school is on the same campus as a church or other houses of worship, thinking about the physical safety, staffing, and the people who are on the campus at any given day, how we communicate between all those different groups, and then thinking about a couple takeaways for next steps for how to minimize the risk and maximize the community aspect of those co-located spaces. So starting at a high level, just thinking philosophically, what does it mean? What inherently can sometimes feel like tension if there's a school and a church on the same campus? So starting with the hours of the day, right? Often schools have preset hours. We want your kiddos here at 7:30. Please come pick them up at 4:30. as a set schedule of the day. Whereas for a lot of churches, there may be a larger kind of open door policy. There are no set hours, and we want to welcome people into certain spaces at any time. There may be small groups, community building groups all throughout the week. Certainly on the weekends, we may expect more people there on a Sunday or other events. And so again, just starting at that philosophical level, sometimes those two things can feel in conflict with each other. As our shared spaces, we think about parking lots or big outdoor fields or areas for events, where cars pull up in front for pickup and drop off for schools. How are people walking onto or exiting the campus or buildings? And so there's a complexity to these shared spaces, right? I think if I said to you, we have one big building, Shannon, and half the doors are locked and the other half aren't locked, you would say, well, Kat, that doesn't really make sense. I'm just going to walk around to the other side of the building. And so inherently, we recognize that doesn't really make sense. But when sometimes we're in the mindset of, well, the school and the church are two different entities. So even though they're in the same building, we have different practices. And so for something like a shared building like that, we really need to think about how the consistent policies are more important, or need to make that truth true, no matter how many different entities we think about. If it's one big building, it's one big building. And so another area so we have a bunch of different examples of clients, schools that are co-located either with a business, with other schools, or different houses of worship. And something that comes up sometimes is the idea of anonymity. As an example, your church might host an AA group in the church as part of kind of one of those community groups that come together. And I think by definition, often those people may not be as comfortable kind of signing in and going through a visitor policy. There's meant to be anonymity in that. Whereas with schools, we're not necessarily inviting anybody from the community in at any given time, right? We want to keep an eye on who's visiting. And if you're not a staff member, a student, or a parent, we do want to decide whether or not you're going to come into our space. And so that's another example of where we sometimes see these philosophical considerations bump up against each other when we're thinking about mission alignment and safety and security. Also recognizing a lot of times, and often it's designed to be this way, but school staff members may be a member of the congregation at church. Students and families may be members of that church. And so you may see staff and community members and students worshiping together or overlapping in activities in a way that you don't always see in a school that's not co-located. And so that is so wonderful in so many ways and relationship building, and adds that layer of complexity that we want to think through from a safety and security perspective as well. We also recognize the diversity of the communities who are our members of the church and who are the students that are enrolled with us. Could have different backgrounds demographically, in a lot of different ways, experience with the community and training. And so thinking, the example before was sort of sometimes those populations overlap so much, right? The congregation and our school community sometimes overlap a lot. This is sort of thinking about it in the other way. What happens if those two different groups, community-based groups, are actually not overlapping that much? And the added challenge of, do they know each other and interact, and how do we communicate in a different way? So that's a lot of kind of considerations, right? I think a lot of those probably rang true as areas where sometimes we feel the natural tension. And so then thinking about kind of, so what can we do about it? Going to that next level of how do we think through those thoughtful philosophical pieces and make a safe community for everybody. And so here's one example. I kind of used a quick example about this earlier, but what is our expectation of doors or gates, right? We can't have half of the doors on the exterior of a building locked at all times, and we monitor those, and then the other half of the doors open to anybody that wants to come through. It just inherently doesn't have that continuity needed for either best practice to be true. And so we also think about the interior of the building, right? Sometimes there's a main hallway that connects some school classrooms with some church spaces, or those shared spaces we talked about. Maybe there's a shared gymnasium, as an example, shared parking lots. And so we want to look at those spaces together, members from the school and the church, doing a walkthrough of why might we need this to be locked or unlocked at certain days of the week or times of the day, versus what are your needs? And then how do we come up with one set of expectations? And so that at the end of the day, you can say, these days, these times, these doors and gates are unlocked. These dates and times, the expectation is it's always locked. And it's true for both the church and the school as well. Same thing if there aren't any security personnel, even if you don't have designated security personnel, we always want to have staff members who are standing and looking when a door is open to the school. You want to have a staff member with eyes on that open door so that we can see if someone is walking through that looks like they're not supposed to. And that's also a best practice for the church as well. So whether it's gates, exterior doors, or personnel watching when those are open, that you want to be really aligned for the whole campus across the two communities there. Corey just put it in the chat. If anyone has thoughts, examples, questions as we're going through these, would love for you to put them in the chat. We can either pause to answer them together, or I can keep an eye and try to work them into as we're talking together. So adding on to that, thinking about centralized access and what we're asking people to do when they come into a building. So a lot of times schools have visitor management policies. You might have to show your ID, get it scanned into the system. Are we doing that on all the entrances certain times of the day or certain days of the week? We should be doing that across the campus, and then norming, maybe there's dates and times where we don't do that across the entire campus as well. Same thing for parent visitors. This comes up often, whether or not a school is co-located. Being really thoughtful and intentional about what we are telling our parents the expectation is. If my kiddo goes to your school, can I come in and sit in the back of the class anytime I want to observe? Can I sit with them at lunch in the cafeteria? Or do I need to make an appointment before I'm even allowed past the front office? Being really purposeful with giving those expectations to parents in particular can help kind of set the tone for who we as a community expect to be walking around the campus at any given time. Security cameras and security guards, but even if we just think about the cameras as another aspect of, is somebody proactively watching those? Who has access to those if something happens and we need to look at a recording? Are there blind spots, places that the cameras don't cover between the church and the school? And so the complexity of where do we have cameras? Hopefully it's one big system on a campus. Maybe the church and school have two different systems. Is there people on both staffs that can access both camera systems? Really being thoughtful. And so many of the examples just sort of land at this point of thinking about it as one big campus instead of two communities, because if something happens in one area and then moves to another, we ideally on a camera want to be able to follow that movement, follow that incident on the camera, regardless of where on campus they went, inside a building, outside a building. And so doing a campus-wide audit of any blind spots of cameras is one area we often see that alignment work start for where we're trying to purposefully align between communities. Then we kind of think about, so what's even written down in our emergency plans, right? And so areas where we've seen gaps in our work between schools and churches are, we have a plan. Sometimes it's 2 plans, right? We actually recommend to have one big plan for a campus because there's so many shared practices, but sometimes just what's written in the plan hasn't been talked about with church staff, school staff. And so we haven't actually told anyone what's in the plan. No one really has access to it, right? I don't even know how to reference it as a congregant member who comes to church for services or a parent of a new kiddo going to the school. Like, how do those 2 people access what should be this one same plan? How often are we updating that? Do we have folks from both communities on that plan as like a response team and communication norm? So if we only have school staff on that plan, it kind of limits the church's ability to be involved in that, right? Sometimes there's someone like an office coordinator for the church who's always on site anyway, and they should be embedded in that plan as an example. And then that added layer of training of response. So we'll talk more about training a little bit later. So flipping it, right? So how do we resolve some of those gaps that we notice? So training for everybody on the plan, having a comprehensive emergency response team, updating those materials at least annually, posting the plan and evacuation maps, campus-wide maps in all shared spaces, and making sure guests or congregation members, people coming for events, people have access to that. It doesn't have to be the whole plan, right? We often have a really comprehensive plan, and then we have a 1-pager that we post that kind of summarizes it and at a glance, which happy to think through with anyone. If it's, okay, we have this big plan, how do we get the quick hits on a 1-pager, right? We want to have that posted everywhere on campus. And so these are the types of scenarios. So, right, so once you're doing kind of that connected walkthrough of campus, thinking about facilities, updating your plan, you want to be thoughtful about what are scenarios that could come up that we can plan for, that some are very likely to happen, right? The things that are more likely to happen often have a lower impact, or these statistically unlikely things to happen, but we still plan for and worry about because they would have an incredibly high impact. 2 of the most extreme examples often that we hear about with that, like slip and fall claims, are the most common insurance claim in schools, right? That is very common as a health and safety concern in all buildings, schools, but also in churches, in offices, right? And so that has a high frequency, lower impact, right? Often doesn't mean someone didn't get hurt, but often only impacts that one individual. Much higher likelihood, lower impact. And then what often we get so many questions about, which all of us I know think about, things like if someone came on campus with a weapon, right? Statistically a low likelihood, and we still plan for it because of the impact that could have if that ever happened. So what we've done is name, frankly, some that I think are kind of in the middle, right? Middle likelihood and middle impact, but that we want to make sure we have thought through and practice and plan for. So if there's a guest pastor delivering a sermon, but doesn't know the facility or any of the emergency protocols, or exit doors being blocked because we were moving things around within the church space. What happens if we have a substitute teacher, right? This comes up in schools all the time. How does a substitute teacher know what the expectation of them is if there's an emergency? What happens if a kiddo goes missing? They get upset, they run out of the classroom. all of the sudden, are they in the church? Are they in, are they in the school? Are they in the larger church space? Are they still on campus? And so planning for things that really could have a high impact because we would get a lot of people involved. So these are a small number, many, many scenarios, but the push is just to be thoughtful about planning, again, for things that are very likely to happen. Kids fall on playground equipment all the time and get a sprained wrist, right? We want to minimize that, even though it impacts just that one kiddo. And then the high likelihood and the high impact, low likelihood, and everything in between. So now diving even more into some sort of stamped next practice takeaways, just kind of continuing on the same buckets, but wanting to kind of name some quick hits, things that you can write down as, oh, let me come back to reflect on this as we're thinking holistically about this work and areas for closer alignment. So we've talked about physical security. I think starting with the parking lot and the perimeter of campus, right? So if I looked at Google Maps at your school campus, what would I notice about the bounds of the land, right? Is there one big fence and gate around the whole campus? Sometimes, sometimes not. Does it back up to a woods area? Does it back up to any body of water? Thinking really high level, think that Google Map view first. And then often what you can also see on Google Maps, right, is the parking lot. Is it a shared parking lot? Are there designated school parking versus church parking? And then if you go down below Google Map lens, and if I were driving up, now would I know that? Do I know where to park if I'm going to these different areas? When it says visitor parking, does that mean a visitor of the church or a visitor of the school? Things like that. So is it clearly marked where I'm allowed to park and enter the campus if I'm coming to the church versus the school? And then, of course, exterior lighting, right? And so in the parking lot, outside of the entrances and exits, some of those basics, but alignment across the two organizations as well. And then what layers of monitored entry are there? And so there's not any one of these on their own that is way more important than others. It's about thinking about which of these layers do you have and how do they work together, and are there any gaps? So which we've talked about, do visitors sign in and out when they're visiting the church or the school? Do I know where to go if I pull in? Do I even know where the front office is of the school versus if I'm trying to talk to somebody at the church? Am I just signing in, or am I actually giving my ID, right? Those are two different things. And how is that tracked and that data recorded? How do I know what employees are on campus every day? That's one gap we often see when we do fire drills, evacuation drills. Often our staff does such a good job of taking attendance for kids, but do we know what adults we expected to be outside, and how do we know whether those adults made it too? And so reflecting on your student staff attendance policy is important too. Absolutely. Please don't feel like you have to write all these things down right now. We're going to send out this slide deck afterwards. So hopefully that feels helpful. And then locking doors. We've talked about that, especially so exterior doors, right? How can you get into the building? And then you really want to be thoughtful about interior doors as well. If you practice lockdown scenarios, just for privacy, if people want their office to be able to lock up their belongings. And again, so the consistency of what kinds of door locks do you have? Does one person have a master key that can open any door in the building? Does that open all the school doors or the church doors as well? So that being a really thoughtful and intentional decision. These are just a couple things that fall under the much larger umbrella of physical security. And then communication, right? You can imagine this is really kind of the bread and butter of what of what holds it all together, because you can have a beautiful, all updated facilities, all the best safety procedures. You can have a beautifully written plan, right? We've crossed every T, dotted every I. And if no one knows what's in the plan and we don't know who to tell in case of an emergency, we don't know how to communicate between the organizations, it's kind of all for naught, right? And so what happens if there's a threat? If the school gets a threat on social media, how are we telling team members from the church? Is there a way, if a congregation member feels uneasy about something they heard or observed, that they can report it? Does that reporting go to the church or the school too? How are we messaging to the wider community? Let's just think, if there's a snowstorm or heavy hail or rain, something weather related that comes up all the time, how are we communicating if we're doing an early release day or closing for the day? I told you I live in Jacksonville, Florida, so we plan a lot for hurricane days, right? Like, you have to be able to communicate to people who would normally come on campus that please don't come on campus right now, or we're modifying what we're doing with people on campus. So what is that notification system and how are we practicing that? Are there panic buttons? What do those panic buttons do, right? We have a lot of conversation about, oh, we have these buttons. Well, if you press it, who does it call? And we don't always know. We haven't always tried it and thought through the whole chain of communication that those buttons can support with if properly installed. And then, which we've talked about as well, like, where do I look to know the protocols of the school and church I'm at? Where do I look to show the evacuation maps? And are those two things consistent across the entire campus? And then that plan we talked about, and then practicing that plan. So that would be emergency protocols, right? We often think about evacuation. That's like the traditional fire drill, which we've all practiced so much growing up and often practice with our schools the most about. But there's these other responses that we encourage us to learn the common terminology of and practice as well. So that's lockdown. If there's a threat on campus, that's shelter in place. That term is often used for weather-related incidents. Secure campus, that would be if, let's say, a mile down the street, something's happening, there's police presence, there's a robbery or something a mile away. So the threat is not on campus, but we want to have heightened awareness of the exterior of campus. And then hold is inside the building, often used in like medical emergencies. So if someone was in a certain room, we had to get EMTs to that person, we would want to limit movement, hold everybody where they're at so that emergency personnel could get to that place in the building. Those 5 emergency protocols often are sometimes called other terms, right? It's actually less important to me that you have exactly the terms we have on here, and more important that they're scripted out and the people in your community know what to do in those situations and have practiced. Reunification plan. So what happens if the whole campus has to evacuate, right? If there was a very specific bomb threat, if a pipe broke and there's water going throughout the entire building, if there was really a fire in the kitchen, maybe there's a shared cafeteria between the church and the school, and there was a real fire and smoke, and so we did the evacuation and then said we couldn't go back in. Where's everyone going to go? Is there another church close by, or a community center, or another school where we've practiced or at least talked to them about, hey, we would come here in case of an emergency, for emergency reunifying kiddos and their parents. And then incident command structure, which is the fancy term. It's not actually that fancy, right? It's what FEMA, the national government, uses. We use it for consistency of language because it's what our emergency responders know the terms of. It's really just who does what during an emergency, roles and responsibilities. The incident commander is the person in charge, often the principal, right? But in an emergency situation, they would have different roles and responsibilities. And so have we thought through who would do what? Maybe there's one facilities manager who works on behalf of the whole campus, right? He's a shared staff member between the church and the school. That facilities manager should be on that incident command structure chart in case we ever need to turn the gas off or power off. Support emergency personnel with facilities things. That person who has the whole key ring of the 100 keys, right? That's an example of the shared commonality of understanding of roles and responsibilities and planning for emergencies. And then we want to practice. So you can practice in a lot of ways, right? We can move our bodies to build muscle memory. Again, think about the traditional fire drill. We often set off the alarm so that we all get used to that really loud and abrasive noise so that we know what that means. We physically get up, line up, walk outside, stand in the parking lot or on the field, take attendance, practice walking back in. Same way, we encourage schools to practice physically things about lockdown, right? Locking the classroom door and moving away and turning off the lights. Tornado drills where you go to an interior hallway, drop, cover, and hold, often in like California where we're most worried about earthquakes. So the exact drills we practice can sometimes change based on geography and other factors, but we want to be really thoughtful about what we're practicing and with who versus tabletops. So a tabletop, it would be something like this, where we're all together in a space talking through a scenario. So I would write at 4:38, this happened, who's in charge, right? And so we're thinking through a fake scenario. We're not actually moving our bodies to practice, but we're cognitively checking our understanding of roles and responsibilities during an emergency and how we would communicate. So that is another really important type of practice that we encourage you to do, especially between church and school staff together. Those can be really meaningful in building confidence. And again, we've talked about who actually has the copy of the plan. Hopefully the roles and responsibilities and the response you're saying is clearly written in the plan. And so making sure you're using that document, right? It's not meant to live in a binder on a shelf that someone looks at once a year. It's meant to be a helpful resource tool. And then being really cognizant of when you're training leadership at the church and the school versus all staff versus added stakeholders like students and parents and the congregation and community members and board members and everybody else, right? All of those stakeholders should understand what the responses should be, should practice and think about it in some way. But you can imagine what we're asking each of those groups and people to do is going to look a little bit different. That was a lot of information. I kind of talked at this group for 37 minutes, but I'm curious. I would so appreciate any thoughts in the chat about maybe an aha moment of something that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. If there are any questions about anything that I said, or if you're willing to share, would love to know just kind of an action item maybe you jotted down in reflecting of, oh, we should look at that or do that. So Corey, I'll give just a minute to see, leave space for folks to write in the chat about any of those things.
Yeah, and I invite people to put their camera on and unmute themselves if they'd like to just speak into the full forum if you feel better about doing that, or if you want to put it in chat. Thanks, Amber, for making sure everyone knows what they're supposed to do in an event and not just training for the kids. Yeah, practicing with kids is important and confidence building. And at the end of the day, our hope is kids are following the directions given to them by adults, which might change in different scenarios. So it's really about empowering the adults as well.
Thanks, CJ. Planning to review policies with both the church and the preschool staff together. Thanks for having that as a takeaway. Coordinate communication between church staff and preschool staff. Yeah. Sometimes, right? And the solutions are sometimes more strict. I don't mean to imply that it has to be like a fancy app that everyone is using. That could be a text thread between the 3 or 4 leadership team members from the church and the 3 or 4 school admin leaders. That's a really meaningful communication tool, which maybe you can start that text thread today or this week, or in addition to kind of more formal systems of how do we notify larger groups. Requiring vendors to have and present ID to enter the building. Church vendors often come during the school day. Even school vendors, right? Who's delivering food and coming to fix something. And yeah, you want to, not because we think all those people are gonna cause harm or someone's gonna try to sneak in that way, but because we care about those individuals. We want to know a vendor came and they never checked out, and I hope that person's okay. Let's make sure they didn't slip and fall somewhere. Let's make sure if we're evacuating, that person evacuated with us, right? It comes from this place of really caring about knowing who's on campus every day.
Yeah, Kat, I'll just share an experience. When I visit schools, oftentimes I will arrive at pickup time. And I think it's really important for our school leaders to really inform parents on language that they can use and protocols that they can use when somebody arrives at the same time they do that they're not familiar with. Because I've come onto many campuses and people will just hold the door for me and allow me to walk in, even though they don't have any idea why I'm there. So recently I went and picked up a neighbor's children from a daycare center here locally. And they said, make sure you take your ID because, you'll get in the first door, but then they'll require you to have your ID. And, I've let them know. And I said, okay, never been there before. I know where it is. So familiar with, how to get in. And other parents were picking up. I was allowed all the way into the building and nobody ever questioned me. I went all the way into the classroom. The child recognized me, was excited to see me. No teacher got up. And I helped her get her stuff. And I asked the teachers, does she need anything else? And they said, nope, she's all set. And they said goodbye to her and we left. And that's really scary to think that, there were all these things in place, but nobody, I seem to know what I was doing. And I think parents want to be really kind to other parents and caregivers. And so nobody was prepared to step in and say, like, we need to see your ID, or we need to know, make sure that you have permission to pick up this child. So, and I think that happens more than we realize.
Yeah. It's that balance of, we want to be welcoming. We want to be know families. And sometimes that level of awareness can just decrease, right? Because it's a sign of being so comfortable in your space, which is not a bad thing, but we shouldn't let our guard down or not follow the procedures we have in place because we're so connected and comfortable with our community. And so that tension and balance can definitely be held at the same time. You can feel so safe and keep yourself so safe at the exact same time. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. What I want to just leave you with is just information about if questions come up, or what your, scenarios you want to think through, or anything that maybe you jotted down as a next step that a thought partner could be helpful with, or more formality of, I would love for someone to come out with a set of fresh eyes and do an assessment and help us think through how to prioritize these things, feel free to reach out to us. Our email address is support@Jaffe Emergency Services. Corey will send a follow-up email. I'll give my personal link and information, and you can connect with me directly or a team member. But know that we're looking forward to continuing this partnership. We're here as a resource. Our goal is always to be proactive, but you have kiddos at your school all day today. And so where we can support with anything reactive happening in the moment, or reactive, like something happened, we want someone to help us debrief, we of course are there for that support as well. So
Absolutely. Thank you, Kat. And just to add, I see a couple people asking for the recording. Again, the recording will be available for all of the registered attendees, and we will put it up with access through our member information center for anybody who wasn't registered to access later. And I also want to bring to your attention that the ELEA is currently working on a toolkit for our members to access some of the most common modules with Jaffe Emergency Services. And these would be their training modules and templates for creating safe spaces. More information to come soon about that partnership. And please watch the newsletters and the Google group postings for more information on that. Kat, thank you so much for being here and bringing all of this information. I will make the slides available with that recording. And if anybody else has follow-up questions, you can always reach out to myself or our membership director, Melanie, or I will make sure that you have Kat's information as well.
thank you all so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.